The lore of Dark Souls 3 is obscured. By the time the Ashen One awakens, the story has already come to an end, and we are just here to experience the final moments. But what few snippets of storytelling we do get to see are often themselves shrouded through carefully crafted cutscenes, only showing just enough to give the most vague hints of lore and story progression. But what if we could take control of those cutscenes and see what's happening just outside the view of those handcrafted camera movements? Hello everyone, my name is Lance, and today we're going to use the developer debugging camera to take a look at all of Dark Souls 3's cutscenes from entirely new angles, and see what discoveries and oddities we can find. Dark Souls 3 begins with the Ashen One rising from a coffin at the untended graves. Off camera, we get to see our protagonist doesn't quite fit into the coffin as elegantly as it appears, with their body mostly clipped inside of the geometry. A little later, Vort of the Boreal Valley makes an appearance, seemingly emerging from some kind of void. If we place the camera behind this void, we can see that it pops into existence first. And then just a moment later, Vort comes into existence behind it and simply walks through. Afterwards, a group of gargoyles fly the Ashen One down to the undead settlement. This moment is interesting because the game is able to elegantly transition between two separate maps, Lothric High Wall and Undead Settlement, without a loading screen. The way this is done is that the game has already fully loaded the Undead Settlement by the time the cutscene begins, and all of Lothric High Wall has been removed, except for just one very small high-detail asset upon which the Ashen One is standing for the first few moments. After being flown far enough away, the asset is also unloaded and replaced with a low-polygon version of Lothric High Wall instead, which we can then see in the distance from the Undead Settlement. In an optional cutscene, the Ashen One steps into a cage and is taken to the Pit of Hollows, where for a moment we can see Hodrick in the distance walking slowly. If we take manual control of the camera, we can see that it looks like Hodrick is meant to be holding something in his left hand, before his right hand strangely snaps backwards at the wrist. I also noticed that if you freeze the game the instant the cutscene ends, Hodrick's face doesn't load. When Patches fools the Ashen One into stepping out onto the lowering walkway, the camera switches to a first-person perspective as Patches gloats.
Thought you could outwit an onion.
However, using the debugging camera, we can get a look at what the Ashen One is doing during this moment, and we get to see this incredibly bizarre pose.
Well, say hello to the nice giant. He adores visitors.
Eventually, the Ashen One encounters the Abyss Watchers, locked in their strange, endless battle. Not a lot is revealed when taking control of the camera, but it is at least nice to see this moment from a wider angle. Partway through the fight with the Abyss Watchers, we get this scene where one of the Legion rises up to challenge the Ashen One directly. The developer camera lets us get an overhead view of this moment, and we can get a whole different angle on this strange blood effect flowing in from every corner of the room. The encounter with Wall Nia begins with this cup filling the room with a thick darkness. And while it's cool to see this happen from a new angle, it's also interesting to see how exactly the transition to Wall Nia's arena actually occurs. As I'm sure you can guess, it doesn't take place in the same room the Ashen One was just standing in. In fact, it's a compartmentalized arena floating way out past Anor Londo. Once Wall Nia is defeated, the opposite occurs, and the darkness is all pulled back into the cup. If we zoom out for this moment, we can really see how this effect is achieved with this huge torrent of darkness being sucked back into the cup. For the scene where the Ashen One performs the rite of Aval, not a lot is obscured, so we don't discover a lot through manual camera control. But outside of the cutscene, we can see Anri's face is covered, and their helmet is lying next to them. If we take the camera beneath the cloth, we can see that Anri does indeed have a face. But even more interesting is that inside Anri's head is another tiny helmet. My personal favourite moment in Dark Souls 3 comes when Sigvard of Katarina arrives to fulfill his promise to Yorm. I love this one moment of focused dedication from a man who otherwise spends most of his time scattered and indecisive. With manual control of the camera, we can see that Sigvard is already standing there when the Ashen One walks into the scene. And when the camera would normally cut away to show Yorm up close, Sigvard actually takes up an animated battle stance that we wouldn't get to see typically.
Sigvard of the Knights of Katarina have come to uphold my promise.
Although he does eventually freeze in place. The Dancer of the Boreal Valley arrives in the same fashion as Vort did, emerging from a frigid void, this time suspended in the air. If we take the camera up into the air to view this from another angle, we can see that she is indeed curled up in a ball waiting to drop down from the void throughout the scene, even before we are usually able to see her. The Ashen One isn't actually loaded into the scene when the camera is focused on the Dancer. After defeating the Dancer, the Ashen One places the Basin of Vows below the statue, which subsequently fills with blood. From a different angle, we can see that the basin is actually filled with blood much earlier than we're meant to see. And the Ashen One is doing something strange with it off camera, before eventually striking this odd pose. The Ashen One encounters Oceiros in the mausoleum after this.
You ignorant slaves. Finally taken notice, have you?
I never noticed how elegantly cross-legged he's sitting until I got a look at him from this angle.
You ignorant slaves. Finally taken notice, have you? Of the power of my beloved Ocelot, child of dragons.
But other than that, there's not a lot to see here, regardless of the camera control. A meeting with Oceiros precipitates the path of the dragon. Looking out towards Archdragon Peak, the Ashen One drifts off. If we spin the camera around, we can capture this peaceful moment front on and unobscured. By ringing the bell at Archdragon Peak, a storm rolls in and the environment is transformed along with it. By placing the camera in front of the belfry throughout, we can capture some of this happening in real time. I always find it impressive that the game engine can handle these changes in real time. When the Ashen One defeats the Wyvern, the Nameless King steps down, taking the creature into his sword in a huge flurry of lightning. The The debugging camera shows us that the Nameless King is not actually seated on the wyvern, instead just floating in the air slightly before stepping down onto the ground. We can also get a clear look at the moment the wyvern abruptly disappears, no longer obscured by the turbulent storm. After the Nameless King's defeat, the storm rolls on. This too is handled in real time. With the Ashen One warping over to the opposite end of the bridge afterwards. Now I'm going to show you something that you're never going to be able to unsee.
Oh dear. Another dogged contender.
When the twin princes are introduced, there's this unusual grey tube vibrating behind Lorien just at this one moment.
Have your rest.
Using the debugging camera, I discovered that it's a bare foot sticking up through the ground. In fact, there's a pair of these feet following Lorien throughout the entire cutscene.
Lord interests me none.
If we take the camera below the ground, we can see that Lothric, or at least a copy of him, is actually floating deep below Lorien, following his movements with his feet inexplicably just stretched way up behind him. So from now on you'll never not notice the strange grey foot floating behind Lothric every time you watch this cutscene. You're welcome. And of course, once Lothric is defeated, Lorien joins the fight.
For that is our curse.
By manually controlling the camera, we can see that one close-up on Lorien's face takes place with the twins actually floating in the air, just to let the camera get a good angle on it without clipping through the floor. Once the lords have returned to their thrones, the Ashen One is kindled for their journey to the first flame. It's nice to get a new angle on the embers floating down into the Firekeeper's hands.
To the true heir.
Now, before we continue into Dark Souls 3's expansion packs, I just want to take a moment to say a huge thank you to everyone who has supported my work on Patreon. There's no way otherwise that I would be able to justify the colossal time and effort investment that goes into creating these videos, so without their support, these videos would absolutely not exist. Going forward, all Patreon supporters get access to the unedited source footage used to make these videos, containing lots of stuff that doesn't make it into the final edit. If you'd like to consider supporting the channel on Patreon, you can find a link at the top of the description, but either way, let's keep moving. Gale is found clutching a scrap of painting at the cleansing chapel, into which the Ashen One is pulled. Seen from another angle, the illusion becomes clear. The Ashen One's forearm is shrunken down into a tiny speck, before their whole body dives through Gale, ending up suspended below the floor. When Ariandel asks for Frida to be summoned, she emerges from the darkness to engage with the Ashen One.
Not Father, we have no need of thy flail.
Interestingly, she's actually standing at the stairs right from the beginning of the scene, long before we get a chance to see her. And her walk is fully animated, despite the camera typically still being focused on Ariandel and the Ashen One. I disabled the lighting here just to see how she actually emerges through the staircase more clearly.
I can see it, feel it.
When Frida is at first defeated, there's a dramatic moment of Ariandel taking in the situation before breaking free from his chair. Strangely, the bloodstain that pools around Ariandel is actually repeated a number of times across the floor. and as he looks up, there's actually two of these fonts in front of him for some reason, which we wouldn't typically notice due to the scripted camera angles. In the ringed city, Lap eventually recovers his memories and embraces his true nature, kicking the Ashen One into a mediocre trap. Taking manual control of the camera, more than anything else, just gives us a look at the awkward movements involved that we normally wouldn't get to see.
I'll stick you in my prayers. A fine dark soul to you.
When the Ashen One comes to Filionore's rest, she's found embracing a shell. In the cutscene following, the shell elegantly breaks apart, awakening Filionore. Interestingly, with the developer camera, we can see that in the moments that the debris from the shell are out of frame, they're not only absent from Filionore's lap, but at one point they're actually floating behind her, haphazardly reassembled back into a sphere shape. In the following moments, we're flung far forward through a transitory history to a desert at the end of the world. This entire area exists physically in the same map as the ringed city, just far up in the sky above the rest of the area. Of course, here is where the Ashen One is finally reunited with Gale, still seeking out pigment for his niece's painting. He initiates a battle with the Ashen One by flinging a corpse in their direction. With the free camera, we can see that he's devouring this corpse off camera even long before he comes into frame. And we do get to see him throw it towards the Ashen One from another perspective this way. Despite the Ashen One not actually being loaded into the scene here. When Gale is injured, he's invigorated enough by the revelation of his own blood that he props himself up and assumes a far stronger stance.
The blood of the dark soul.
Despite being mostly obscured by darkness, I did still want to capture this moment at a wider angle, just to see the entire scene play out a little more clearly.
Is this the blood? The blood of the dark soul.
And so here we come to the ending cinematics. And simply at first, the Ashen One chooses to link the first flame and to rest, looking out towards the eclipse. As is often the case, nothing new is revealed by seeing this from another angle, but it is indeed a small treat regardless. Conversely, the Ashen One summons the Firekeeper, and the fire fades into darkness. Accompanied by the free camera, the Firekeeper can be seen almost climbing out of the ground during her summoning. In the following moment, when the Ashen One takes the fire for themselves, the camera is zoomed in tightly with a vignette obscuring a lot of the scene. If we pull the camera back, we can get a clearer view of this moment. And I found it interesting that the Ashen One's whole body is animated here, even though just the lower portion is visible in the final product. In the final ending, the Ashen One rises and the eclipse follows in sync. Before we see a pair of Dark Wraith maidens kneeling before their new lord. The scene ends as the Ashen One proceeds through an audience of hollows, Unri amongst them. With the developer's free camera, we can see how the effect of the eclipse rising is achieved, in that it is actually a physical prop floating in the sky that rises in time with the Ashen One's animation. Further to this, the two Dark Wraith maidens do have a small animation that goes unseen, as they also stand as the Ashen One rises. They then kneel, which is the only part that we'd normally be able to see. From another angle, we also get a slightly more comprehensive look at the audience of hollows, with Henri kneeling to the left-hand side. So assembling this video has been a colossal effort, and if you did make it to the end, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope I was at least able to show you something interesting along the way. If you did manage to enjoy the video, you can let me know by hitting the like button, or maybe even leaving a friendly comment below. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, as I'm always doing my best to show you new things, and it would be wonderful if you chose to stick around for that. I also have a second channel, a link to which you can find in the description, where I actually just got to do a preview of the upcoming game, The Surge 2. So if you're interested in what I think about other video games, feel free to take a look at that. Either way, thank you for watching, I'll see you next time.